Welcome to Cracking Legal Innovation, the podcast where we go behind the scenes with people reshaping how legal work gets done. My name is Daniel Porras, Chief Commercial Officer at LegalTechHub, and I'm joined by my co-host, LegalTechHub CEO, Anthony Seal. Based on the June 2026 LegalTechHub Gen AI map, there are about 1,200 Gen AI products in law, and this has roughly tripled in just over a year. For innovation leaders, the challenge is no longer finding tools. It's knowing which of them deserve a firm's time, budget, and trust. To discuss this, we're joined by Nikki Shaver, co-founder and CEO of LegalTechHub, the platform tracking over 2,800 legal tech solutions worldwide. Nikki practiced law with top-tier firms, led innovation at Stikeman Elliott and Paul Hastings, and was recently named in the inaugural Financial Times Law 50, recognizing the lawyers, entrepreneurs, and technologists shaping the future of the global legal sector. Today, we unpack how firms can cut through the noise and build real frameworks for prioritization, risk, and value. Welcome, Nikki.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan.
So, Nikki, I really do not feel there could be a better person to dive into this topic today. You, through LegalTechHub, track, as we mentioned in the intro, 1,200 Gen AI solutions. And I think through your own stats, it's something like 950 providers and some 100 companies forming, every quarter. And these stats are just crazy for anyone to navigate. Like, for someone in innovation at the moment, can you just give a bit of context as to, what this, the map and the landscape looks like?
I think this is probably the most challenging time for people in that kind of role ever. Partly for this reason, and partly also just because there's so much to do. But I mean, you can imagine, you have to solve a problem and you have your massive, broad AI legal assistant products that you use internally. And that's, covers off a ton of use cases. But then there are still areas where you need to go deep with point solutions or something that is more uniquely built out to suit a particular practice's needs. And so it's really, how do you look at this incredibly complex landscape and identify the solution that is right for you? How can you even know? There's, when you're looking at that many products in the market, you can't possibly test them all, you can't pilot them all, nor obviously should you, but it's really complicated. One thing I think is quite interesting is the map is often used at firms by innovation leaders to help explain to law firm leadership why it's so difficult, but also why one solution is not the answer. So I think that's the other piece of it is there's been this assumption made by some managing partners since generative AI launched, and you have the big players like Harvey that, okay, we've reached a point now where you can just buy one thing and then you're done. And of course, that's not the case. So it can also be useful just to be able to point at it and say, not only is it not just one thing, but also this is muddier than it ever has been, and wading through it is really, really difficult.
So maybe just to dive, there are so many things in what you just said that require a bit of a double click and to go a bit deeper, but maybe on the first one about the, how things are playing out from these, platform plays versus point solutions. In the world that we're entering into, do you see a role for point solutions? Is it just going to be the bigger players that sort of take over everything? Can you give maybe a bit of a thought on that?
For the first time, I think we're seeing the market probably shift really quite dramatically. Certainly at the moment, yes, there is still absolutely room for point solutions. I think the way that they show up might end up being different. What I mean by that is your traditional platform, so where lawyers have always done their work, that's also shifting a little bit. So perhaps when you came into work, you'd switch on, your DMS to pick up a document to keep working on or open a matter, and Word, obviously, and Outlook. And what we've been hearing for the past couple of years is that increasingly lawyers come in and they open Harvey or Legora instead of Word or the DMS. Obviously, they're still working in Word. Things have not changed that dramatically. But my sense is that we will still have point solutions, but they might be accessible through other platforms, right? So MCP has made that more feasible. We're seeing a lot of products, even the big legal players, allow their product and their functionality to be available through Claude. And I think that will continue. And so, yes, I think we'll keep having point solutions because entrepreneurs that have specialized knowledge are really good at solving unique problems in their particular area, and they can often solve them better than a broad solution. But I don't know. I honestly, if you look really deeply into the future, maybe things will change.
I think there's point solutions that will survive. I think there's point solutions that won't survive. I think there are platforms, and I put ourselves in the platform category. And I think being a platform right now, I'm really happy we're a platform. But I also think MCP really does change things because it used to be like you go back a few years and law firms were like, oh, why didn't the vendors just talk to each other? Why didn't my tech stack all come together? Why can't I take the thing from the thing and put it? And with MCP, you don't have to do that integration work each time. Things just connect, right? So a model can just jump on top of an MCP and suddenly things start talking to each other. And I do think that means that the right tools that form part of this kind of integrated stack will do really well, and the opportunity to be part of a broader tech stack, which and what's in that is changing, what you need in that's changing, but the connectivity piece I do think changes, but I do think also like law firms are just starting to get there as well. Like there's a lot of law firms. Like I think a lot of I don't know. I'd love your perspective on this, but I think a lot of legal leaders have gone to a talk on MCP, or they've probably gone to 10 talks on MCP now. How many of them have actually experienced what that means for their working daily lives? And for me, it's been quite an emotional thing seeing my entire world of work change as a result. I don't know if they kind of like understand it theoretically, but maybe they can't quite see what this means in terms of like where everything fits in and what it feels like and how workflows change. I don't know if you have a perspective on that.
Nikki, as you give your perspective, I'm just conscious different listeners might have a different level of knowledge around, even the terminology MCP and what it does. Can you maybe just explain from your perspective what MCP is and
Yeah,
then take on it?
yeah, absolutely. So MCP is a new standard that was released towards the end of last year and really has gotten more traction this year, which essentially makes it much easier for AI systems and agents to connect with one another. And it allows for uh, products to become and the features of those products to be accessible through another system or platform easier than once was the case where you actually had to build out specific integrations, like a bridge between two systems. So it just allows for systems to effectively speak to each other much more easily. And what that does is you can be in one platform or interface, like Claude, for example, and through it, as long as you already have licenses to use other systems and they have MCP and they've made that connection available through Claude, you're then able to pull in data from those systems or features and functionality from those systems. So Anthony, I think it's a really good point. First of all, I completely agree. I think firms are still early here. There's some sophisticated firms, I think, that are maybe exploring on experimenting a little bit, but I don't think we've really landed yet at where we're going, which probably actually changes the way that law firms procure and deploy technology. Because I think that it will become what are the capabilities that I need rather than what are the tools that I have to license. And you'll be able to get those capabilities in a number of different ways through your MCP environment. And the question will be, what is the front? So what is the interface layer that my firm decides is, for whatever reason, best for my lawyers and staff? And through that interface layer, that front, I will be pulling in the other capabilities. So I think it's going to fundamentally change the way that we actually use technology and access it. That I also want to say to your point about, some point solutions will fail and others will succeed. I really think we're about to see a significant shakeup of the market. There are point solutions that I think are in trouble, and they may not be the ones that people think. When people think about risk in the market and volatility, I think they often it's obvious to think that the earlier stage startups are the ones that are most at risk and will fail. But of course, with early stage startups, if you've developed something relatively unique or something that has differentiation in the market and the technology is good and the vision is good, you are easily acquirable. And we're seeing a spate of acquisitions now by the bigger legal AI platforms, and I think that will continue for some time. If you are more mature in the market and you've had stability for a long time, the difficulty is you're likely too big for an easy acquisition by a strategic player. At the same time, though, your point solution might be able to be replicated by a broader platform that is building out in all kinds of ways. Probably not to the same efficacy as what you've built, but enough so that law firms might decide this is good enough. It's good enough. We don't need, the fancy, more expensive additional license for this. We'll just access what exists in something we're already paying for. And that expansion in the big legal AI players, I think, is probably the death knell for a number of those products that fall kind of in the middle. And so that's my concern for the market. It's my concern because I am fond of a lot of the products in the market, but realistically, I think that's what's going to happen is that we're going to see a number of point solutions that simply will not be able to make it. And even for private equity, if the technology is easily replicable now, it's a tough sell. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
To that point, Nikki, something I'm seeing as well as you're sort of talking consolidation on the, the market level and just like the viability, I feel in a lot of my conversations with innovation leaders at firms, there's a lot of pressure to consolidate their tech stack as well. And, budget, yes, they're having to make their really big investments in their, AI tool or tools of choice. But then there is that question ultimately, where can we save some, money? And there's almost more scrutiny around all the other products. Is this something you're seeing? And then how I don't know, if my sense is it's fueling a little bit of this discussion that maybe is going to accelerate exactly what you're describing, but would love your perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We started surveying the market around legal AI back in 2024, and one of the questions we asked was, are you reviewing your tech stack in light of AI? And even back then, the answer overwhelmingly was yes. Now, what's interesting, because we do advisory work with law firms as well, and we're being pulled in more often to do things like review of tech stack to look for overlap. One of the things that has happened, of course, with kind of the convergence of solutions, the expansion of features in the big players, and the proliferation of startups in the market, obvious because you can build more and more easily using generative AI, is that we are seeing far more overlap and it's really difficult to avoid. So if I'm someone in a law firm buying legal tech, I already have a solution that I've been using for years for contract review and due diligence, but Harvey and Legora do those things really well now. If you have a really strong M&A team, you may want to hang on to your thing, but there's a limited period of time where what you have licensed historically remains better than this functionality in the bigger players. And so firms are making those decisions. They're letting things go in favor of using capabilities in other platforms that now have grown to overlap with what they already had in their tech stack. And I think that kind of review is going to remain necessary on an ongoing rolling basis as things continue to change in the market.
Curious to get your perspective. Like sometimes when I talk to law firm leaders, actually, you talk to them about the big sort of AI provider choices they've made, and noting your conversation that they're doing more and more and more. Sometimes those law firm leaders are actually least wanting to sort of show buy-in and commitment to those platforms. So you talk to them, they're like we've got Harvey licenses and we've got some Legora licenses and we're not committed and actually we're rolling our own thing, and there's almost sort of the most like for some of their biggest tech decisions and their biggest spend right now, there's almost some of the sort of most reticence to say we're definitely doing this as this is our long-term direction we've brought into the platform. I don't know if that's something you're seeing and what might be kind of behind some of that, whether it's sort of fear of them being usurped by those providers or the lock-in or token-based pricing suddenly changing everything.
I think they're hedging, Anthony, right? They're hedging. We don't know where the market is going yet. It's not settled. I don't know when it will be settled or if it will be settled. But I think they're hedging. I I do have a personal frustration about that whole. We have some Harvey and some Legora and some co-counsel, and we have a pocket over there of Spellbook. And this is probably unfair, but a part of me feels as though that also is the result of not having the decision frameworks in place that allow you to make a good decision and actually have that conversation with your lawyers. And the difficulty, of course, is that people have had pilots now that last a year. And I think that's not happening as much. More and more, I'm seeing head-to-heads that are kind of shorter. But if you have a long-term pilot, which people were doing initially to really get a good sense of what these companies offered, then you have lawyers that become wedded to one or the other, and it's really difficult to wean them off their preferred platform. And so that's what's happened. People are not saying no. And my fear around that has been we're going to end up in the Thomson Reuters LexisNexis, vision of the future where everyone has to have both Harvey and Legora, if those are the two that end up, you know, carrying on. And I don't think we know that yet. I think the Claude thing is different. Claude and OpenAI and whatever you're using as your kind of frontier lab build, law firms rolling out. It's funny. I think we're still in the point where Harvey and Legora are quite sexy in the market. Jude Law, Gabrielle Macht. But they are perceived as, the big, sexy, fast players. Everyone is licensing them. So what's the effect of that? It's the same. It's not where you get your differentiation from. The firms at the beginning that thought, I'm going to be the first in with Harvey. We're seeing it now with Frontier Labs, right? We see Freshfields and Anthropic, and it's Wilkie with OpenAI. There's something interesting for clients about being the first in, but that's not a competitive advantage long term if everyone is doing the same thing. So my line on this has been, it's like buying Harvey and Legora now is like buying a DMS 20 years ago. It's not, it doesn't, yes, you need broad AI enablement, but it's not the way to set your firm apart. So I think firms realize that, and they're starting to do more around what will actually differentiate them, which is building lasting, embedded AI functionality in the areas where they already have legal expertise that differentiates them in the market. In other words, using AI to really amplify their special sauce and using their institutional knowledge built into products that are not easily replicable because the feature of them is actually legal expertise rather than just the technology. And that, I think, is why we're seeing a lot of the kind of frontier lab enterprise licenses. And I think there are a few other players out there. New Code is one that is, really honing in on deep agentic capabilities that allow firms to do that kind of thing.
I 100% agree. I mean, I think that's where firms already have their USPs. That's why you go to the brilliant patent firm. That's why you go to the world's leading employment law firm, because they can do those things, and it's about the implementation and the build things got easier. So I think people were terrified of, probably quite rightly so, putting their neck on the line for a tech project that involved a build internally in a law firm. That's much less risky now, and you can really start to kind of build new internal capabilities that double down on what your law firm USPs were. And I think that those projects, I think, you want room to fail, you want nice, like warm space where the failure is celebrated, which isn't always there in law, but you create that, and firms can create really cool things. And I feel it's our job to kind of bring that together, like have a state of the transaction where we can allow all these elements to interact. And we're certainly having more conversations with firms where it's like, we've got this team that built their own thing, or even this lawyers like vibe coded something. They didn't even ask anyone. They just thought like there's a cool thing, and they just ran with it because they could create a thing. And now we kind of don't know what to do with it.
It's like we're in another wave of the whole build versus buy debate. We know the tools are such that the lawyers themselves can go off and build something. And there's the question of how much does that then just continue to live, on their laptop and never actually manages to get beyond that into something that is somewhat production grade, by the firm? How much is it being killed by the firm itself and not sort of facilitated? And, there are reasons for and against facilitating that. But then you also see the build versus buy debate happening at a law firm level. So many firms that I'm speaking to now that to some degree are thinking of, that have gone on the buy journey after maybe some failed builds and are now coming back around to it even. And I find it fascinating. I really love your take on that, Nikki, because it feels like we've been here before. We've sort of talked through, we've seen the pitfalls of some of those that some have done it successfully in the past, right? But many have tried and failed. And it kind of feels like I don't know. I personally feel like we're maybe setting ourselves up for failure. The firms maybe setting themselves up for failure, but is something different this time around?
I actually think that now it's not build versus buy. I think you have to build and buy. I actually think you do. I think the firms that are buying and not building right now are behind, and potentially grievously so. Um, y- but building means something a little bit different than it used to. You need less technical expertise, really. You do need someone with technical expertise who can make sure that there is the kind of discipline around the build necessary. But I think you have to be doing something there. Firms also have, although still not as much as I think they should be, but they have typically now also hired more people on that dev side for innovation teams. So you have more capabilities. And of course, with more capabilities, it's just natural that you will also have more in the kind of build category. So I think you have to do both and R&D. So R&D now, it's kind of ridiculous when you look back and you think firms didn't have that. They didn't have it because they never really thought technology was important. Before generative AI, technology was a support at a law firm. It was not strategic. It is now strategic. And as something that is strategic, you need to understand always what is coming next. And that means you need money set aside. You need budget for R&D. Agents, although I saw the first one sort of being built out for legal specifically back in the fall of 2023, really, they didn't start hitting law firms until last year, and they really only became good this year for law firm use. But you had to know it was coming, and you had to know what that means, and you also need to know what the risks are and how to govern for those risks. And so you have to have R&D. The vibe coding thing I think is fascinating, and that is a throwback. You also can't just deploy, 500 little solutions that your lawyers have vibe coded to practices and expect them to be used and also, maintained. And so I think one of the things I think is really interesting is that you're seeing actually providers come out that do hardening of code on the back end to review code that has been vibe coded by people who actually don't understand coding at all and ensure that there are no security risks and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's a funny thing because you want people to be excited, but at the same time, it cannot be the Wild West out there.
I definitely see like a blending of I remember all those debates as well, going to the conferences, like should lawyers learn to code and things like that. And actually, like what we were really discussing is like how can lawyers kind of productionize their knowledge? How can lawyers do these cool things that they want to do? And
Yeah.
the obstacle was that the lawyer had to learn to code, and the lawyer's highly paid and highly trained, and the coder's highly trained and highly paid as well. And going and learning a whole new skill set was was really difficult. But like lawyers have the ability to prompt now, or I don't know. It depends on whether the firms actually let them, or they'll go and do it on their own laptop or something like that. But you have that ability to be creative in new ways, and I would have absolutely like loved that. And now I do vibe code things, but it does create this whole it does create this whole host of new problems and fragmentation. And I think that's why maybe firms are also a little bit like, you can't, like, going back to that piece, you can't just rely on Harvey and Legora to be your innovation. If you can support these products or these vibe coded things or the ideas behind them, or your most creative lawyers who can actually think beyond their day-to-day legal practice and think like, well, how could this be productized? How could, we build something that wasn't even possible by humans before? Or how could we use our expertise and some coding to offer an entirely new service? I think that's the sort of thing firms should massively embrace. And I have heard of a lot of these projects sort of becoming a little bit headachy in terms of firms. Like, it's not secure. We need 24-hour support on this. I do think MCP is a little bit of an answer to that, because you can keep something running on your local host, and you can go and get the data you need, and you can go and put the data back. And even if a lawyer has one thing that's useful to them on their own laptop, like that can still be a thing, if you give it the right connectivity, and things are a lot less scary if you're not exposing them to the internet as well. So I think there's sort of new models, and then and you have this fragmentation, this explosion, which I think we should massively support. But then you have this whole set of new challenges as well that comes with it. And being an innovation leader in a law firm right now is wild.
The creativity is awesome, right? And that kind of thought process of how can I solve this problem for myself is exactly what we want people to be thinking at the moment.
Do you think people are being allowed to do that in their firms? Are they like encouraged to? Is it a cultural thing? Is it like, are they allowed Claude Code on their laptops? Like, what?
I don't think they are allowed Claude Code typically on their laptops, but I do think that there's more invitation to play and experiment than there once was. It depends. It really varies from firm to firm. Different risk appetites, different levels of governance and understanding as well. To your point, Anthony, I mean, there are ways of making this safer, and having engaged lawyers who are excited about this is much better than prohibiting something and making it all sound incredibly risky. And in the former scenario, you also probably have lawyers who are then more excited as well about technology that you license and deploy and where you want, because they kind of get it. And so it's something you do want to encourage, but there have to be some guardrails around it for sure.
Nikki, I'm interested. I mean, the role of an innovation leader was challenging previously, but it seems like all these things that we're talking about now, on the one hand, even just determining what your AI tool or AI tools of choice are, getting that onboarded, the continuous onboarding as things develop, that sort of challenges around capacity for supporting that, let alone then what we're just discussing around all these vibe coded solutions, managing all of that. What does it mean for the innovation role in a law firm at the moment? And where does that go to from here?
In some ways, it's flipped. So I think the most challenging thing previously about being an innovation leader is that it was like, it's that classic kind of Sisyphean problem. You were constantly trying to encourage people to be interested in working in new ways and adopt technology. And you were trying to affect change in an organization that was highly resistant to change, typically because law firms have been very, very successful doing things the traditional way, and lawyers are risk averse by nature because that's the job. And so it was just a really difficult thing to do. It was like really like the classic square peg round hole problem. Now it's almost like it's the opposite. It is, everyone is so excited. And again, that makes it sound like adoption is easy. It's not. You still have resistance, etc. But the point is now there's so much happening that it's less about, pushing that rock uphill, and it's more about reining things in, making sure you're being focused, making sure you're making the right decisions, and also running fast enough. I think the real challenge at the moment is everyone in these roles is drinking from a fire hose. And it's not just the tech, it's not just, the map you mentioned previously, Dan, and the complexity of the market and all of the decisions you have to make, and the overlap, and, how MCP is going to affect this, and how you're going to govern all of your AI tools. But it's also what are clients doing, and how can you make sure that the firm is in a good position to deliver work the way that clients will want to ultimately. And it's also, how do you train your lawyers and staff on AI on a continuous evolving basis and make sure that they are digitally native enough to really keep up. And it's also, how do you train the lawyers of the future? And it's also, how do you think about the value of legal work and how you price it? And it's also, how does tokens play into that? And what will we do if, the firm has an increased budget, but we suddenly move to consumption-based pricing on tools we already license? And how do we handle that with our lawyers? Like, there's so many different things to think about. How does MCP change the downstream governance of our tools, and how can we possibly cope with that, and how can we educate our InfoSec people on it? It crosses so many more functions. Like, now innovation really should be deeply ingrained with professional development. It should be deeply ingrained with pricing and finance. It should be deeply ingrained even in, like, business development now can be very AI driven, and different things can be done there. But it really goes to the business model of the firm itself. And so managing partners have to understand this. They have to understand that, in my opinion, we are really in an existential moment for law firms. And so that is, I think, a lot of innovation and AI leaders also are dealing with the fact that they need their leadership to understand things at a deeper level. And while managing partners know that it is important, they don't necessarily understand the degree to which this could fundamentally change everything. So it's really interesting. The one thing I will say is, what has remained the same is that there are still structures in traditional law firms that make this difficult. And unless firms are willing to start shifting those structures, there are hurdles, and those hurdles, again, could prove to be existential for firms in the sense that it may prevent them from moving fast enough to meet the moment.
Without going down the wormhole of what all of those are expressly, I mean, are we talking about things like the partnership model as a whole and short-termism, billable hour, like those sorts of things? Or are there other things specifically that you would call out, Nikki?
I am worried for firms about, I think it's very easy to sneeze off something like your AI native firms as a flash in the pan, and the kind of the new boutique law firms or new law model firms. I think they are indicative of something that is really fundamentally changing in the market. And we're just seeing the very, very tip of the iceberg now. But what's interesting to me, if you look at these, is that there are lots of different types of AI native firms. The ones I think we really need to be focused on are, well, two really. One is, I can be a partner at a large law firm with a book of business and real expertise, and leave the firm and set up my own firm with highly capable AI and do a huge amount of business for myself, much more easily than I've ever done before, with no associates, no assistants. So there's a real risk in that. You can really see a kind of potential fragmentation where lawyers realize what they're able to do, and people are doing that. The other is product companies that start moving into the services market. And we've seen that now again and again. We saw it first with Udia and Norm AI, Orbital. It's happening more, and I think we'll start seeing more of that. You referenced, Dan, earlier, you said something about our firms frightened that Harvey or Legora will essentially come for them ultimately. I don't think it is the intention of either of those companies to become law firms. I do think it's inevitable that the parts of legal work that can be commoditized will be disaggregated from law firms themselves in such a way where, why would a client pay to go to a big law firm for something that they can just pay off the shelf for from an AI native firm or a product company that does it just as well with, one lawyer to oversee results? I mean, or themselves, do it themselves. So that's where I think we're going to start seeing the market fragment, and the big, huge traditional law firms with massive overhead and, office leases for years and years and years, and a requirement that lawyers come in and do work in the traditional way. there's not going to be the market to support all of them. There just won't be.
I think it's almost a problem now to call this innovation, or a problem to say that this is one person's job in a law firm to fix and provide technological answers for. This is the entire law firm. This is exactly as you say, it's the training, it's the pricing, it's the business model, it's the how we operate, it's the like what are we even selling in the first place. Like in every other company, this wouldn't be on one person in the organization to solve. It is, you see these transformations happening in every area of the business. In our company, it's everyone's role to understand how AI is changing marketing, how AI is changing coding, and it's those functional leads' job to answer some of those questions themselves. And I do think it's wild in law firms when we put that all on one person and say.
To your point, Anthony and Nikki, you'll be able to comment to this because you speak to so many innovation leaders every day, but we see it firsthand how much it is becoming a top business priority, innovation and the purchasing decisions. Like suddenly it's the managing partner who's involved in assessing technology. And that's both like we've seen it coming up in the renewal discussions where suddenly it's the managing partner signing off, not the, and we've seen that the sales cycle, which will be hitting some of the earlier stage companies even more, I assume, but the decision-making process is longer because these are seen as strategic decisions that are being made into what technology you're buying. So I am seeing much greater scrutiny. I think it's overall, I mean, there are pros and cons to it. I think overall it's a good thing because you're getting that buy-in from the top. And I think we're already seeing the impact that can have on things like adoption because it is, the investment's being made, it's being mandated at the top. I think that can be a positive thing, but it's also creating an absolute headache for so many people. And that delegated authority that we've seen for some of the innovation leaders, I get the sense that quite a few are feeling somewhat disempowered at the moment because it's almost not just their decision anymore as to what they do. But I would love your take on that, Nikki.
It's a really tough position, right? On the one hand, they are mandated to do so much more. And on the other hand, in some ways, their authority is being undermined because now decision-making sits at a higher level sometimes. That's really interesting to hear. I mean, I do agree with you, Anthony. I think that's part of the problem is that it sits everywhere and it should sit everywhere. Innovation sits everywhere. AI will affect everything. The business model is subject to more pressure than ever before. It's something that should be handled at a firm-wide level. And I don't think firms are addressing it that way. And they should be. The technology decision-making is just one small aspect. But it's interesting to me that managing partners are coming into it because it may be that they realize that this is something that they should care about and where that kind of leadership is necessary. But the tech decision is only one small part of what this is about. And I'm not sure that's realized enough.
I think they get brought into it in both a positive way and a negative way. The positive way is like we understand this fundamentally this is of fundamental importance to our business, that we have to have a strategy here, that we have to be rethinking pricing, that we have to be rethinking how we do the work. And then I think there's a slightly negative way where they get brought in, which is just like they're seeing costs blow up, and they're particularly in a partnership model, everyone in the partnership's looking at the kind of like, this is how much money we made, and this is how much we spent, and this is how much I take home at the end of the day, and they're questioning that spend item, saying like, why? And the elected managing partner who has been elected by these 300 people who are all saying, well, what's this spend, is having to answer to that in a much bigger way. So I think there's a danger in general that, I mean, law firms have always been massively willing to invest in people because they see them as generative and profit generative, and I think they do need to think much harder about how technology comes into that, both from the kind of profit generation side and from the what are we willing to spend on this side, because getting a law firm to spend X on an expensive person is usually much easier than getting them to spend the same amount on technology.
If that person is a lawyer, if that person's
a lawyer, yeah, if that person's a lawyer, and if you try and get them to spend the same amount on a development team. Having said that, some of the I think that law firms that are on this and are putting budget towards it also can't even find the talent to do it. So there are a lot of like open innovation roles at large law firms right now where they're putting very punchy salaries behind it, and then they still can't fill the roles with someone that has the knowledge and expertise. So
Yeah. There are a limited number of people in the market with that kind of expertise, right? And discipline and desire to do that kind of work at the moment. I think it's been interesting to see a lot of moving out of law firms as well, into other types of roles. Harvey and Lagora hiring these kinds of people, for example, Thomson Reuters hiring these sorts of people. There's a lot of opportunity in the market, and yet law firms need them more than ever. And yeah, the pricing thing is really interesting, the budget thing. Kirkland made a big splash by coming out and saying that they were spending 500 million over the next 5 years on AI build. So that is additive to their internal licenses. And people were kind of shocked by that. But if you look at it against what other businesses spend on technology, it's still tiny. I mean, it's so law firms have been, to react because budgets are blowing out. It should be the opposite. It should be, how can we find additional funding to throw at this? Because it is, the critical thing right now.
like the calibration's just way off. Like when we hire a developer, the amount we allocate for AI tokens compared to their salary is really, really significant, and we're happy about it. And you see memes in the kind of like tech founder kind of world where like the CEO is so happy because like they've spent so much on tokens, so they must have been productive or something like that.
It's just so funny you said that right now, because literally this morning I had a conversation where someone was saying that in the development world, you're seeing coders be fired if they're not using enough tokens, because it is a metering mechanism. And it's something I'm really fascinated by is as law firms move to as AI providers move to consumption-based pricing, it does actually provide law firms with a mechanism that is like the billable hour in that it's quantifiable and is an indication of how much work has gone into something. And I do wonder whether that makes it easier to pass on to the client.
I think it might actually help them just because it's so aligned with how they
Right.
already think, which is like there must be a
Exactly.
thing that we can kind of package and bill. Like it wouldn't be
Exactly.
that hard for them just to sort of say, okay, we're going to measure our law firm by, amount of deals we do and average price per deal, average, like everyone's like, what's the solution to the billable hour? It's just like, how many things did you sell and what did you sell them for? Like it's not a difficult question to answer, but I think it's the kind of attachments we have to this like unit based pricing.
Which we should move away from, but it is, you could imagine that we could get to a point where we can say, this M&A deal was, cost more because and you can see how much work was involved because look at how many tokens.
Look how many tokens we used,
Exactly. Exactly.
nothing's a perfect measure, and there's certainly a lot of pushback. So especially with like Fable releases and stuff, like the bills are like companies that have encouraged that and put leaderboards up in terms of like token use in most of the world have already kind of gone down that route, realized that they're encouraging huge levels of token spend. Then some of the models have got a bit more expensive, and now they're kind of pulling back from that, and they're trying to look at it. But like law hasn't even got to the point where haven't even got to the point where they're paying for the tokens. Then they need to get to the point where like they're happy that people are using the tokens and spending the tokens. Then they need to get to the point going like, oh, this is a bit expensive on the tokens. Like maybe we shouldn't like. But I don't know. Like law's got a massive culture of like how many hours did you do? That is your unit of work. That is how much we've got a measure of how much, and it's never been a good measure because you may not have been working particularly effectively during that hour or not. But it's the same with tokens. You might have been wasting it on the wrong prompt or not prompting efficiently or using a too expensive model or something like that. But it's crude, but it sort of works, and it's coming.
I think one final question on this topic, Nikki, and then I've just got one final question for you overall. I find it very interesting. We're sort of talking about cycles that are happening with the build versus buy. I think the other one that's coming up is a lot of the debate around things like, well, obviously we're talking about value here, and this is what I'd like your take on, but the discussion around how do you account for the cost of the technology that you are actually buying? And it feels to me like there's another wave of massive scrutiny over how much the technology costs, how you're accounting for it, what does value actually look like. This has always been fascinating in our space because I always wondered when we brought Legatics to market, is this something that's going to be on charged to clients? Is it something that will be absorbed as has an impact on gross profit margin? And in that way, it's ended up being both. And actually, we saw a move away from on charging to absorbing it internally. We're actually seeing a bit of a shift, starting anyway, where there's a lot more scrutiny and a lot more of a ask on some of the innovation teams to, wherever possible, find ways to recover the cost for their technology spend, or at least then otherwise account for the value that's being created. And we're actually finding ourselves consulting effectively a lot more in how to articulate the value of the offering and sort of, drawing on the experiences we've had with other customers and what we've done there. But it feels the debate's coming up very strongly again. Is this something you're seeing, and how are you thinking of value in this context?
Yeah, it definitely has come up again. The way that I look at it, if you look back, technology is not typically able to be charged to a client when it just becomes expected. It's of course it's just part of the service that is offered. That's when clients will stop paying for it. When it is something that is very expensive, which this technology is, and which you don't necessarily have to use on client matters, but if you do, it adds value, it makes sense to charge for it. Especially in circumstances where it's not across the board that you would use it. So I think there is an argument to be made that there should be a surcharge. I've spoken to so many people about this, and a lot of firms just will not do it and don't consider it to be, you know, the way that a law firm operates, and it is just part of the service. But if you look at e-discovery is the one area that kind of it really developed and evolved first in legal tech, in the sense that the work that is done is inextricably linked to the technology that delivers it. And yet there, it's still very typical to charge for some technology component because there's a deep understanding across both organizations of the value that it brings. And what you would otherwise be doing is so inferior to use of the technology. And there's an understanding of, what the cost is. I think it will look similar for a time. What I really like is the evolution as well of timekeeping tools that are able to show you, or even AI technologies that have built into them AI kind of tracking mechanisms that allow you to see pre and post AI time and break it down so that it makes it much easier for the firm to show the client this is what it would have previously cost. We're now charging you significantly less, but there is a percentage surcharge to cover the technology involved, or you can pay for us to do it the old way and it will cost you this much more, but without the technology surcharge. I think there is probably a transitional period where that might happen. In the future, everything will be technology driven. Like all legal services will have some component of AI in the way that it is delivered. And I don't think you will charge separately. I think that's just part of the whole offering. But I do think we're in this weird transitional period where people need to figure it out because it is so much more expensive than what we've had before.
Nikki, absolute final question. But just if you could give some advice to, say, an innovation leader sitting in a firm at the moment that's feeling a bit overwhelmed by everything that's going on, what would that be?
Speak to clients as much as possible. Clients are very rapidly gaining in sophistication. Bringing the client voice in has always been the most effective thing you can do when it comes to persuading leadership of the importance of something. If you get clients on board, you'll be more likely to get the attention of the managing partner. But also look to the market and beyond the market for the kinds of data that will help you make the case to management about why more resources are necessary and why this is not, the problem we're focused on for this year alone, but probably for the next 10 years.
Nikki, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to speak, and this has been a really great conversation. So thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much, Anthony and Dan. It's been lovely.